It's great to be here to celebrate the life and work of Gary Becker. I was not a student of Gary's, but his ideas, his passion for economics, his clear-headed intellectual courage was an inspiration to all of us. So I do sort of count myself as an indirect student of his. But it is sort of intimidating to give a paper in his honor because you want the paper to be very good. We'll see. You decide that. So, but it is in the sort of tradition of Gary in the sense that it is trying to answer some macro questions, but using applied micro type of reasoning, and in particular, it is going to emphasize that flexibility of technology, flexibility and comparative advantage in human capital of man and humans is actually greater than what sometimes people might take it for granted. So this is joint work with Pasquale Restrepo, who's hiding somewhere at the back. He's being shy. He's not usually shy, but I don't even. Oh, there he is. He's there. And Pasquale, all the good things here owe to Pasquale. And I should also advertise that Pasquale will be on the job market with even a more impressive paper than this. So you should definitely see his other work. Don't just judge him on this. So what is this paper about? It's about a very common concern and discussion, which actually is not that sort of new. There has been periodically discussions over the last century almost that new technologies are going to replace men and women by machines and are going to destroy jobs. And there is quite a bit of evidence for this, or at least there's quite a bit of evidence that might deepen your worries on this. There has been reduced wage growth. There has been increased non-employment, and also reduced labor share, as documented by several papers over the last decade or so. And many people sort of link this to these new technologies replacing tasks that were previously performed by labor. And these were sort of views that Keynes, Leontief, Heilbronner, and many other economists expressed over the last 80 years. And it hasn't always come true. Can it come true now? I think what we need is a framework for sort of thinking about what is it that technological change does? How is it that it could be steadily ongoing, even if it keeps on replacing tasks previously performed by labor? Because actually, as I'm going to argue, it's not a new thing that technology is doing such things. It's always been the case. But so how is it that for almost 200 years, technological change could be ongoing without non-employment becoming a major problem, but how it could become a salient issue during certain episodes and whether or not the market is self-correcting. So the main new ingredient here is that in addition to technological changes automating existing tasks that were previously performed by labor, there will be also creation of new tasks. So that's the additional flexibility. So in particular, if you look at many of the kind of marquee technologies of the last 200 years, you'll see that they have an element of this sort of capital-labor substitution. The stagecoach was replaced by the railroad, sailboat was replaced by the steamboat, dock workers by cranes. But in all of these instances, together with this process, there was also a creation of new jobs that were labor-intensive, or that actually had that created comparative advantages for labor. So you created new class of engineers, new types of managers, financiers, machinists, repairmen, new kinds of operators. Some of those are more skilled than others, but generally there has been two types of technological changes that are noteworthy, not just one: automation and creation of these new tasks. So in particular, this is sort of the conceptual idea here. A lot of the work is going to be to make sense of this conceptual idea and draw out its implications. But Leontief quite famously, or quite tellingly, I don't know whether it's famous because it was sort of 50 years ago, but quite tellingly asked the following question. He said, machines replaced horses, why not labor? And our answer is that horses don't have comparative advantage in new tasks, human labor does. So that's the sort of key conceptual answer. So I've already sort of outlined what the structure of the model is going to be at some simple level. It's going to have two types of innovations: labor replacing innovations that enable capital to replace labor in previously labor-intensive tasks, and creation of new tasks in which labor is going to have a comparative advantage. So we're going to first understand the static structure of this. This is just pure labor applied micro. And we'll see that this structure, though it sounds familiar in many ways, is actually quite different in some of its implications. Then we're going to put this in a growth framework. And in particular, we're going to show that when there are incentives to undertake these two types of technological changes that are endogenous, why there is a major self-correcting factor. And this self-correcting factor is going to imply that under some conditions, of course nothing is true without some assumptions, but under some reasonable conditions, even when you have periods of very rapid automation that decimates labor's prospects in the job market, there will be self-correcting forces that will make the economy bounce back. And I'll talk about when there will not be these self-correcting forces, then there will be these sort of self-correcting forces. Okay, without further ado, since time is short and I don't want to just talk about it when I can sort of be a little bit more precise, I'll just jump into the model. But let me just say what this model sort of relates to. It relates to several literatures, to all of the human capital stuff, but more specifically it relates to three lines of work. One is sort of models of capital labor substitutions at the task level. The first paper on this is by Joseph Zera. It's a really very nice, very simple model. And then I have worked on this with David Otter. Costina and Vogel have an assignment model that have some of these features. It relates to directed technological change models, which I have worked on. There's a recent paper by Hamus and Olson that's also sort of related. And also it relates to models of endogenous shape of the aggregate production function, including the work I did in about 10 years ago, follow-on work by Chad Jones, and very interesting paper by a former Chicago student, Oberfield. Okay, so here is the outline. First, I'm going to provide one piece of motivating evidence for the claim that I've just made, that these new tasks in which labor has comparative advantage is at least something we have to take seriously. It's not going to be a causal piece of evidence, but at least at the correlational level, we'll see that there is something out there. Then I'll present the static model, then go through comparative statics, which are, I think, quite interesting. Then I'll explain how this model, when embedded in a neoclassical structure, generates balanced growth path. And then I'll go through directed technological change. So this is really the full model. So I'm building to it piecemeal, but you'll see that it's actually probably a rational thing to do to build it. I generally don't like it when there are series of models, but these are not series of different models. These are series of models building to it. There are sort of building blocks to this full model. Then briefly some welfare analysis, extensions, and conclusion if I have time. So here is the one piece of evidence I'm going to show. So what this horizontal axis is based on data from Jeremy Lin, who uses the dictionary occupational titles, essentially, but also census data, to classify in a rather simple but labor-intensive way, since we were talking about labor-intensive tasks, how many or how important the new jobs and tasks are in each one of about 330 occupational groupings, I think 328. And essentially he looks at these occupational grouping, dictionary of occupational titles, that big book, and he says, well, within this occupational grouping, dictionary of occupational titles previously said you do X, Y, and Z, now you do T and S, so these are new tasks. So if you do that, and if you put that on the sort of horizontal axis, so 80% means like very, very new. So this is almost very new. So things like management analysis in the 1980s, the radiology in the 1990s, computer design in the 2000s, etc., are these jobs that have very, very large share of tasks. And then here you put the percent change in employment growth. And you'll see and I'm not showing you the regressions, but you'll see what it turned out to be a fairly robust relationship here, that jobs that have a larger component of new tasks in them grow quite a bit faster. And this growth is actually quite consequential if you say that, if you do the counterfactual saying, imagine that there were no new tasks, then there will be less than 50% of the actual employment growth that we observe today. So at least according to this very rough measure, about 50% of the employment growth that the US economy creates over the 1980 to 2007 period is associated in these occupations where there's a lot of things that are changing. There's a lot of new functions, operations, tasks being performed. So that's just to say that no causal evidence, but there is something to this idea that new things are a very important dynamic element of the labor market when it comes to employing labor. Okay, so how are we going to make sense of this? So let me start with a static model. So the static model is going to have some familiar elements and some slightly less familiar elements. So the familiar element is that I'm going to stick to constant elasticity of substitution formulations just to make things simple. As you'll see once you understand the logic of the model, the constant elasticity of substitution is not really that important, but it just makes things easier to see. So we have an aggregate output Y produced from task outputs. So the task outputs are, some people are going to draw the yarn, some people are going to turn it into something else, some people are going to weave it, etc., etc. So there are a range of tasks, and you may need all of these tasks, you may not need them, they may be absolutely essential or not, depending on the elasticity of substitution. The elasticity of substitution is sigma, and so you have yi, sigma minus 1 over sigma, and then the usual inverse of it up top. So the extreme case where you need to do one task and then the other task would be that sigma goes to 0, so you get a Leontief production function. And here the integration is between n minus 1 and n. Why? Normally we are used to this integration being from 0 to 1, for example. You have a bunch of tasks and you get better at those tasks. But what I'm going to assume is that n is going to be the kind of measure of new tasks that we're creating, and this structure already imposes that when we create new tasks, they are replacing tasks from the bottom. So we're not creating horizontally more and more tasks, but when we are creating new tasks, they're going to be more productive version of things that we were doing previously. Of course, reality is a mixture of those two, but this sort of makes things a little bit more tractable and easier to see for our purposes. So therefore, there is this integration here. For now, n is exogenous. I'll do comparative statics with respect to it, and then later on we're going to endogenize n as well as other things. Okay, so here is something that will come relevant later on, but in the sort of interest of introducing everything up front, let me introduce it now. Each task is going to be produced by combining capital or labor together with an intermediate good. So you can't just produce a task by having labor or even capital. You need to combine it with some sort of knowledge. And that knowledge is going to be embedded in some other sorts of machines or something like that. That's one that I'm going to denote by QI. And I'm going to assume that QI is supplied by monopolists. And so for the static model, it doesn't really make any difference whether it's monopolist or competitive, because I'm going to assume that throughout that these monopolists are going to charge a constant markup. So for example, they have some marginal cost mu in terms of the final good. The monopolist has a marginal cost of mu psi, and the fringe of competitors have a marginal cost of psi. So there's going to be a markup of 1 minus mu. You could have an alternative set of assumptions. What I want to do is to have a constant markup here so that none of the results come from some sort of weird behavior of markup. So in the static model, constant markups or competitive are going to be the same thing, because once you have constant markups, there are not going to be any relative distortions. Okay, so here is the main sort of structure of the model. So this slide is as far as the model goes, this is the key slide. So here is the way that you produce these tasks. So either tasks are already technologically automated, which means that we have a way of producing these tasks either by labor or capital. So those tasks I'm going to assume are those that are less than some capital I. So their production function is another CES. So you have these intermediates that I mentioned, QI, and you combine them with some elasticity of substitution zeta with either capital or labor. So the fact that this is capital plus labor means that labor and capital within that task are perfect substitutes. Okay? So you could use either capital or labor, or some combination, of course, but generally you're not going to choose a combination because you're going to go to one of the corners whenever you have this sort of linearity. So that's the first thing. So these technologically automated tasks, you can produce them either by capital or labor and combine them with some intermediate. Second important thing, in front of capital I didn't put anything, but in front of labor we included this gamma I. So this gamma I is going to be something that captures the comparative advantage of labor. So in particular, we're going to assume that gamma I is strictly increasing, meaning that labor has comparative advantage in higher indexed tasks. Okay. Alternatively, you can have that a task is not technologically automated, in which case its production function is simply this. It's the same as this, but it doesn't have the capital because we don't have the knowledge to produce this with capital. Now note that if a task is technologically automated, and this will become particularly clear in 2 slides, if it's technologically automated, it doesn't mean that it will be produced by capital. It means that it can be produced by capital, but whether it is or not, of course, is going to depend on profit maximizing market incentives. So that's the key structure of the model. Okay. Now, just to close it, I need to specify sort of labor market and capital market. I'm going to assume that for now, capital is fixed at K. So when we go to the dynamic model, of course, that's going to be endogenized by saving. And labor is given by some upward sloping supply. So I'm taking this as a reduced form. I don't want to get into the details since this is not central, but you can derive this from a variety of things. But I want to at least leave the possibility that this upward sloping quasi supply is not the same as the labor-leisure trade-off of workers. So for example, if the underlying model, as we do in a separate paper, is one of search and matching, you're going to have a quasi-labor-supply relationship, even if the labor notionally is inelastically supplied. Because when you want to hire more labor, you have to do more search effort, and that's going to increase wages, etc. So for now, though, what's important is that I'm just taking this labor supply to be a function, an increasing function of the labor share in national income. So what is this? W is the wage, and RK is the what goes to capital. So this is some monotone function of the labor share in the economy. Okay. All right. So here is the first equilibrium relationship, and this is where a lot of the economics is. So let me go through this very carefully. Okay. So let CU be the task price or the unit cost of production of a task. It's going to depend on a bunch of things, but most importantly, it's going to depend, of course, on technology, this I, but also it's going to depend on factor prices. What is the price, effective price of capital, which means the price of producing one task, or task I, by 1 unit of capital, is R. What's the effective price of labor? It's not W, because with W you don't produce just 1 unit, you produce gamma I units. So the effective price of labor in task I, or the wage per production unit, is W over gamma I. So CU, which is the unit cost, is going to be a function of R and W gamma I. But in fact, we can write it in much simpler form. And let's look at this here. Let's take a task. Let me start here. Let's take a task that's not automated. If it's not automated, I can't use labor. I can't use capital, so I have to use labor. So the only thing that this task's unit cost is going to depend on is the labor price, effective labor price. So I can write those tasks' price as Cu of W over gamma I. And what is that? Well, since the production function was this Cs, that's just the dual of that. So I can write that as psi to the power 1 minus the elasticity. Psi, remember, is the price, the markup plus marginal cost, so the price at which these intermediates are going to sell, plus W over gamma I, the effective price of labor in this task, again raised to the power 1 minus gamma. Okay. What about if the task is automated? Now we're going to have this price depend on R and the W over gamma I, but it's going to depend in a very simple way, and you can see a lot of the economics from this equation, which is that since these two things are perfect substitutes within this task, I won't use both of them unless they happen to be exactly at the same cost. Or in other words, I'm going to use whichever one is the lower cost one. So I can write that as the Cu being a function of the minimum R, W over gamma I. And then again, the same structure, except that here instead of W over gamma I to the power 1 over elasticity, it's minimum of the 2 to the power 1 over elasticity. So once you have this, a lot of the structure now becomes clear. In particular, immediately you can define a threshold, gamma tilde, which is uniquely defined, which is where, sorry, not gamma tilde, I tilde, which is where firms would be indifferent between using capital and labor. All the tasks below that, they would prefer to use capital. All the tasks above that, they would prefer to use labor. That just follows from the fact that gamma I is strictly increasing, or there is a structure of strict comparative advantage where labor has a comparative advantage in high index tasks, capital has a comparative advantage in low index tasks. And in particular, this gamma I, so this I tilde is defined by this very simple equation, W over R is equal to gamma of I tilde. However, I tilde may not be what we observe in equilibrium. Why? Because as we have already noted, only tasks below capital I are automated. What if I have only tasks below 2 automated, but I want to produce all the tasks below 4 with capital? Well, I can't do it because those between 2 and 4 are not automated. So therefore, in equilibrium, the threshold below which you're going to have automation, equilibrium automation, is going to be given by I star, which is the minimum of I and I tilde. Okay? So here is the structure, for instance. I'm drawing, I'll show you the other case too, but here for specificity, I'm drawing the case where I star is less than I tilde. So technology is a constraint on automation. So this is a task space. It goes from n minus 1 to n. So this is where I would like to be if I could, but I can't because I can only automate up to I star. So these tasks are now performed by capital. These tasks are labor intensive. Now what happens if I have n increase? If n increases, in equilibrium, what's going to happen is that there are going to be some new tasks created from the bottom tasks that were available. So we're going to take the bottom tasks and we're going to create better version of those tasks that now require labor because they are new tasks or they have been designed that way until they become automated at some later date. So that's how creation of new tasks works on the task space. What about automation? Well, if automation just increases I star. So we had these tasks performed by capital. Now we automate those. Since I tilde was above I, or above I star, then an increase in I star is going to translate into an expansion of the set of tasks performed by capital and a contraction of the set of tasks performed by labor. All right. So now, how do we close this model? We have to put a bunch of market clearing conditions. How do the market clearing conditions come? Well, we have the prices, so we can immediately work out how much capital you want to use in task I, how much labor you want to use in task I. Don't worry about the specific expressions, but those of you who have worked many hours with CES production functions will immediately recognize them. But more importantly, if you aggregate those, you get something very interesting. And let me just focus on the capital one. You have the unit cost and the R here as the usual things you would have with CES, and don't worry about them. If the exact functional form doesn't play much of a role. But this is the important part. This is the coefficient in front of it. So this is minimum of I or I tilde, or in other words, I star minus n plus 1. So what that is precisely this range of tasks produced by capital. So in the logic of the model, and this is a new sort of, this model is not that different from the usual sort of factor augmenting models in some ways, but it will have very different implications that I'm going to emphasize. And the key reason why it's going to have that difference is that technological change is going to directly impact this coefficient which expands or contracts the range of tasks that capital or labor performs. And as those tasks expand or contract, demand for those factors and relative demands are going to shift in major ways. So here is a summary of that. A unique equilibrium exists in the static economy. It has this feature that I tilde is determined by that equation that I gave you. I star is minimum of I and I tilde. All tasks below I stars are going to be produced by capital. All tasks above it are going to be produced by labor. And we have and I'll come back to this equation later on, we have an ideal price condition given by this, but you can see already the ideal price condition has exactly the same structure. I star minus I plus 1 on the cost of, in front of the cost of capital, and something that's the integral between I star and n in front of the cost of labor. All right. So, but rather than look at that proposition, perhaps we can look at a graph which shows how the equilibrium works out. So here is the equilibrium. On the horizontal axis, I have the task space. On the vertical axis, I have again, something proportional to or monotone in the labor share. So in particular, I have omega, which is W over RK. Okay. So this curve here, this upward sloping curve, is nothing but this relationship here. It's strictly increasing because gamma is strictly increasing. So what it says is that the higher is the price of labor relative to the price of capital, the more automation you want to have. Why? Because when you do automation, you're replacing labor by capital. The more expensive is labor, the more you want to do it. But you can't do it all the way because you have to stop at this I. That's why it becomes vertical at that point. What is this curve? This is just the relative demand for labor relative to capital. So I take these two market clearing conditions, I divide one by the other, we divide one by the other, we do some minor modification, and this gives us this curve. So we have sort of a supply-like curve and a demand-like curve. Their intersection is going to give the equilibrium. Where is that intersection going to happen? Well, there we have two cases. It can either happen to the left of I, or it can happen exactly at I. So I start with the case in which it happens to the left of I. So in this case, we have that the equilibrium price of labor is low enough that you don't even want to use all of the technologically automated tasks by capital. Labor is not that expensive. If labor is not that expensive, not worth automating things because now capital is expensive relative to labor. That's case number one. We can already do sort of comparative statics here. For example, you can increase n. If you increase n from the logic that whenever you expand the range of tasks performed by one factor, you shift the demand for that factor, the relative demand curve is going to shift up. So remember, again, this comes from here. You have, or you can see it here. This is the range of tasks, the integral between I star and n. If I increase n, this increases, this contracts, so that's going to shift this demand curve out. Similarly, you can do comparative statics with respect to k, etc. No interest in comparative statics to I here. Why? Because I can increase the range of technologically automated tasks by a little bit, but it won't make much difference because we're not using all of those that are technologically automated already. Now, this case is more interesting. Here, technological automation is a constraint. If technological automation is a constraint, now what happens? Now, when all the other comparative statics that I've mentioned apply, but now when I increase I am relaxing this constraint, so I'll be able to move along the relative labor demand curve. So what's the impact of increasing technological automation? Well, you can see exactly like the sort of the common concerns expressed, it's going to reduce the share of labor, share of capital is going to increase. It's going to reduce employment. Why? Because if you reduce share of labor, the upward sloping labor supply, employment declines. What about wages? Now that's where one interesting implication comes. In particular, those of you again who have played with these production functions for a long time know this. It's not emphasized in many micro books, but perhaps it's emphasized in your book. But if you have a factor augmenting technological change, whenever you improve the productivity of a factor, it always increases the wage of both factors. So in a world of factor augmenting technological changes, you cannot have that technological progress reduces factor prices. So in other words, if we were in a factor augmenting world, the concerns that automation or whatever that technological change is will reduce labor share, perhaps, will reduce employment, perhaps, but will reduce wages? No, never. But in this world, we're not in a factor augmenting change because what is technological change doing? It's changing these coefficients in front of labor demand. So immediately you can show that now technological change actually can reduce wages. So in particular, the result is that there exists a short-run elasticity of substitution, which is essentially a weighted average of the sigma and the zeta, where sigma is the elasticity of substitution between tasks, zeta is the elasticity of substitution between intermediates and capital or labor. And if that weighted average is large, where sufficiently large doesn't mean very large, it could be actually less than 1, but there exists a threshold for that sigma SR, such that if sigma SR is above that threshold, automation is going to strictly reduce the wages of labor. Okay? All right. So now this comparative static was already sort of in a different context between different types of skilled workers, was in my paper with David Otter, but I think it's rather important for thinking of these sorts of issues, and perhaps it's not really fully appreciated. Now, perhaps that model was a little bit, these equations were a little bit implicit. I had a relative demand curve you couldn't see. There are two special cases of this model which give you even cleaner, more transparent equations, and I can't resist but show you them. Okay? So these are either eta goes to 0 or zeta goes to 1. The reason why you get all the comparative statics, they work fine, but things are a little bit, not sort of linear or log linear in a very neat way in the baseline model is because you have two types of substitution. And I'll come back to these two types of substitution because they'll play an important role in the future. When a factor becomes more expensive, first you do substitution across tasks between using capital or labor. That's the more interesting type of substitution. But there's another type of substitution, which is that when a task becomes more expensive, you also use intermediates more or less, well, more in general, to deal with that task. Because remember, you have that aggregate which uses intermediates and capital or labor. So it's these two that sort of complicate things. But when you consider either these two limits, either eta goes to 0, where eta, remember, is this parameter. Eta is this parameter. So the weight on the intermediates goes to 0, so the intermediates don't play much of a role. Or the elasticity of substitution here goes to 1, so that the intermediates in a Cobb-Douglas way are always used in a proportionate manner. Then things become more regular, and then you get these really neat expressions. I don't know, we find them neat. So now output really becomes something that is just this very simple expression. It combines capital and labor, but with the coefficients, or what are sometimes called the distribution parameters of the CES, becoming these endogenous objects that depend on technology. And then this elasticity of substitution, sigma hat, becomes a very simple object. And then, exactly what I showed you still applies, but you can derive the equations of those in closed form if you want. Okay. Now, that was a static model, and a lot of the ideas that I wanted to talk about are there. But not the key ideas about self-correcting forces of the market economy. So in particular, if we stop here, we have one framework which says now we have two types of technologies. If one runs ahead of the other, perhaps labor is hurt. If the other one runs ahead of the first, labor is benefiting. But what happens if, as many commentators today think, that we've had 20 years of automation, or perhaps 15 years of automation, running very fast and hurting labor? Is that process going to continue? Is it entirely determined in the twinkles of the eyes of some scientists? Or is the market going to respond to it in one way or another? To do that, I need to embed this in a dynamic framework. And I'm going to do that in two steps. First, I'm going to put just the dynamic framework and capital accumulation into this process. And we'll see why this will take only 5 minutes, hopefully. Okay? And then I'll put the endogenous technology. But there's a reason for Pasquale and I to go in this way, and I'll explain it. So what we do is neoclassical growth now. Neoclassical growth, because I'm going to take technology as exogenous. Technology is a little bit more interesting, or richer, or more complex, or more annoying, I don't know, depends on your perspective, than the solo Ramsey model. But it's exactly that. You have a household with the standard preferences, accumulates capital. You have a constraint like this, which determines the evolution of the capital stock, and that's it. There's the RT, delta, blah, blah, blah. Now, however, and this is already one important thing, I cannot work if I want balanced growth. So if I don't want the growth rate to go up, down, up, down, up, down, with any strictly increasing comparative advantage schedule gamma. So one that works really neatly is exponential. So let us assume that gamma I is exponential with a coefficient a. Okay? And moreover, let's define little nt to be capital NT minus IT. So this is the technological state of the economy, whether it's tilting towards labor, new tasks, or tilting towards capital. So if there's a lot of automation relative to the creation of new tasks, this is going to be a small number. If NT is very large and not much automation, this is going to be a large number. So now you can do the usual tricks, and I'm not going to even go through it, and write everything in terms of normalized capital, normalized output, normalized wage, as you do in the neoclassical growth model. And And so you do CT is ECT over gamma IT, and blah, blah, blah. And then you end up with a bunch of equations. The rental rate is a function of the state variables, NT and KT. The wage rate is a function of NT and KT, etc. And then you end up with two equations that look identical to the neoclassical growth model. So for those of you who haven't sweated over the neoclassical growth model, this will be totally mysterious. For those of you who have, this will be extremely familiar. And then it looks like this. So this is exactly the neoclassical growth model. If you start here and the technological change is regular in a way that I'm going to define in 1 second, then you go to a unique balanced growth path, etc., etc. What does it take for technological change to be regular here? Essentially, we require rho is greater than rho bar. I'll explain why that is. And this NT tends to some constant above n bar. Why do we need these two conditions? Well, first of all, if NT does not lead to a constant, if NT does fluctuates, given that there are these two types of technological changes, one is increasing the productivity of labor, the other one is increasing the productivity of capital, the productivity of the two factors is not going to converge to something, and you cannot have a balanced growth path. So in other words, we need this n dot is equal to I dot. Let me call that some number delta. That's where we need to go. And that needs also to take us to some number greater than n bar. We'll see the role of n bar in a little bit more clearly in a few slides. But essentially, if n is very, very low, only the not very productive tasks to be automated are left. And that's going to discourage automation. Okay? Why do we need rho greater than rho bar? Well, I've made an implicit assumption, and you're all being extremely quiet, which is not what you would have expected from a conference celebrating the life and work of Gary Becker. But you did not call me on an implicit assumption that I made. Then the implicit assumption that I made is that not all new technologically automated tasks are used with capital, but all new technologically automated labor tasks are used with labor. So if I wanted to be pedantically general, I would have had also n tilde, n star, and n star, which is the ones that are used, may not be equal to n because you may not want to use all of the new created tasks with labor. Well, it turns out that there was a reason why we did that, because there exists some rho bar such that when rho, the discount factor, is below rho bar, you always use technologically automated tasks with capital, but not necessarily the ones with labor. If rho is greater than rho bar, then you use all of the ones with capital, with labor, and you don't use the ones with labor. No, sorry, the other way. You use all the ones that are created that are labor intensive. You always use them as soon as they are created, but not with capital. So that's the structure that I've described in the dynamic world is exactly the one where rho is greater than rho bar. So that's what I'm assuming. What about capital? Why do I need this NT greater than n bar? So I explained why we need n to lead to some limit. Why do we need this limit to be greater than n bar? Because I want to also focus on the case where I star is greater than I. So in other words, rho greater than rho bar justifies the assumptions that we've made so far, and n greater than n bar justifies I star is equals to I. Okay? So under those assumptions, this is the structure, and it's extremely well behaved. Okay. Now, one other reason, other than sort of introducing these concepts and showing you how the dynamics work, one other reason that we introduced the model with exogenous technology and dynamics before the full model is this. There is now something quite intriguing which we did not actually expect. It took us several months to realize why things were not working as we thought they would work, and then finally we realized. There's an interesting productivity effect here. All of the comparative statics that I showed you apply when the interest rate is endogenous. What happens is that when you make the adjustments, interest rate adjusts, and it's the adjustment of that interest rate that changes the way that you do the substitution between capital and labor. But in a dynamic model, in the long run, the interest rate doesn't adjust because it's pinned down by the usual neoclassical condition, r is equal to rho plus delta depreciation rate plus theta times g. So that productivity effect implies that in the short run you can have declines in wages, but in the long run you cannot. So already, even without endogenizing technology, there is a force towards increasing wages here, which is that in the long run, capital is going to accumulate, and that accumulation of capital is going to push wages up. So in other words, in this model, you're going to have one of two patterns. Either you're going to have a pattern where you have automation reduces employment and labor share, but doesn't do anything to wages, and then you continue like this. But the more interesting one, which doesn't happen in the factor augmenting models as I've explained, is that first there's a decline, and then you have an increase. But all of this is still without the endogeneity of technology. Okay, so now we come to the endogeneity of technology. So this I'm going to do following the directed technological change models in the simplest possible way. What I'm going to assume is that this NT and IT don't come as manna from heaven, they come from investments. People have to make investments, and in particular R&D investments, in order to create technological automation and create new labor-intensive tasks in which labor has comparative advantage. And to do that, they're going to use some resources. Let me make it really simple. Let's suppose that there's a constant supply of scientists, and they use scientists. So in particular, scientists are going to be allocated between SIT, which are those working on technological automation, and SNT, those working on creating new labor-intensive tasks. And then we assume the simplest functions for that. I dot is equal to kappa I SI, n dot is equal to kappa n times Sn. So the more of your resources you devote to technological automation, the more technological automation you get, the more you devote to n, the more n you get. You need to have something like this if you're ever going to be able to talk about the economy self-correcting or not self-correcting in how it changes the technology. So this is the minimal structure to do that. And then once you do that, you were already, in the static model, we had already computed profits from various different things. So let me write them. I didn't write them there. But the profits of using capital for a task, automating a task, is just this. So it depends on a bunch of things, constant. Output, of course, everything's going to be scaled with output. And unit cost of production when you use capital. And the same thing for n, unit cost of labor, CU, but of course that depends on the effective labor cost. Now here is the key point, which sort of I hinted at, but I did not sort of dwell on, which is that we really have these two substitution parameters, zeta and sigma. Zeta is the substitution between factors and intermediates, and sigma is a substitution between different tasks. So they come in as zeta minus sigma. Why is that? Well, before I tell you why it is, well, let's think about it. Do we want zeta greater than sigma or sigma greater than zeta? Well, I would say intuitively we want sigma greater than zeta. Why? Well, we want that when you use the cheaper factor, it's more profitable. So the whole logic of this model, as I built from the beginning, is that you make more profits by using the cheaper factor. That's why we were doing all of these sort of many exercises. If labor is cheap, we want to go towards labor. If capital is cheap, then we want to substitute towards capital. Okay? So in some sense, there is something weird if zeta is greater than sigma, because it says that profits increase if your factor is more expensive. That really doesn't make much economic sense in a model of substitution of capital and labor. Why would it happen? Well, imagine what's going on here. When labor's price increases, you're going to do two things. First, you're going to substitute across tasks. You're going to start using more capital instead of labor, but you're also going to do substitution between intermediates and labor. So if the intermediate labor production function is very elastic, then you're going to do so much substitution towards intermediates that things really start becoming, screwy. So in the extreme case where zeta is towards 0, this would always be the case. Then we are in a Leontief world. You would need both the intermediates and the factor that's going to use that relevant machine, etc. So you might want to think of that case, or you might want to think of a case where zeta is small, but we're going to take sigma greater than zeta. So now you might already think that, this is generally a very standard model. I mean, the only thing I have varied from the standard production models of capital labor substitution is this task structure and the substitution between tasks. Other than that, there were some minor sort of technical assumptions, but nothing important. Now I'm going to make one more sort of, at first, non-conventional assumption. But at the end now we've convinced, Pasquale and I have convinced that the conventional assumptions here are not the right ones, and this is a better assumption in any case, ex post wisdom. So in these sort of models, what are these models part of? These are part of the endogenous growth models of the vertical quality competition variety. So essentially what they do have is that, Bob has a great idea, and then Robert builds on that idea and does something better than Robert. And then Nancy builds on Robert's idea, and so on and so forth. So the way that these models have developed with Aghion-Howitt, Grossman-Helpman, etc., is that there is a particular patent structure here. And the patent structure here is that if Robert is the best guy out there, nobody can steal his idea. But Nancy can come and build on Robert's idea, and she doesn't have to pay anything for Robert and steal everything. So that creates a very strong business stealing effect. That sort of seemed fine. It created a lot of sort of small instabilities in some of these models, but under the usual assumptions, they were either dominated or not really so important. But there's some sort of strong instability here. If you expect a lot of innovation in the future, that makes you not want to do certain things, etc. Well, an alternative structure is that a patent is a patent is a patent. If Bob has a patent, Isaac cannot steal it to use the same patent, and Robert cannot steal it to build on it. So everybody who uses Bob's patent or Bob's idea has to pay him. In fact, that's exactly what the social planner does. If you look at the social planner's problem, the social planner would always say, well, do I want Robert to build on Bob? Well, he'll look at what is Bob producing, what is Robert producing. Well, that's exactly what we want Robert to do also in a market economy. What can I produce over Bob so that I pay Bob and still make more profits? So if we have a patent structure where everybody who builds on Bob has to pay Bob, then the profits, the net present values, are going to have some discounted terms. And here, exactly what the social planner cares about. Unit cost of producing with R, unit cost of producing with labor. If you do N, unit cost of producing by labor, unit cost of producing with R. So this is exactly what the social planner does. This is exactly what the market economy does, I think under a more realistic patent structure than the ones that generally assumed in these models. But it also has a beautiful implication. Immediately you can see it. When is this guy going to be bigger than this guy? When this is bigger than this. When this guy is going to be bigger than this one. When this is bigger than this. So you're always comparing unit costs. So when you do the production decisions, you are comparing unit costs. Now when you do the innovation decisions, you compare unit costs. If something has low unit costs, you tend to do more of it. In production, when something has low unit costs, you tend to invent more of it, or you tend to try to invent more of it. All right. So then the rest is, again, you write the dynamic equations of this model, and you do the characterization. And now here is this characterization. Suppose that rho is greater than zeta. That's the assumption that I've made. Again, none of this actually works if zeta is greater than rho, because all of these values are negative. If rho is greater than zeta, zeta is greater than sigma, in the creative destruction model, you might still get some action, because even in this case, there might be some weird things going on. In this model, it really makes it clear. If zeta were greater than rho, nothing would work in this model, because you cannot make profits by replacing a cheaper guy, because it's better to have a more expensive factor. It just doesn't make sense. Sigma is greater than rho. so sigma is greater than zeta, all these Greek letters confusing me. Rho is greater than rho bar, and S is less than S bar, so that the growth rate is not too high in the economy. Then there exists a threshold kappa bar such that kappa I less than kappa I over kappa n greater than kappa bar, there exists a unique balanced growth path. In this balanced growth path, exactly the thing that we saw in the neoclassical growth model happens, but more interestingly, this dynamic equilibrium is unique in the neighborhood of the balanced growth path, is locally saddle path stable, and if the elasticity, intertemporal elasticity, is close enough to risk neutral, it's always unique and always dynamically saddle path stable. So what will happen, therefore, is that in this range, if I shock this economy by a wave of automation technologies, you're going to have this period of labor being hammered. But then what happens? Exactly the forces we emphasize in the static model. Now, because of this, labor becomes cheaper relative to capital. Labor share declines. But if labor is cheap, now you want to do more labor innovation. Because labor is cheap, it's out there, you want to use it. So there is a very natural self-correcting force which says that unless we get out of this range here so that we go to the corners, you're going to have this very self-correcting force. Why can you go to corners? Well, let's see that. So here is the proof, so here's a diagrammatic expression. So we are in the range where rho is greater than rho bar. Remember, when rho is greater than rho bar, you're always going to use new labor, but you may or may not use new automation. Where you may not use automation, that's a threshold n bar. If you are below n bar, you may not use you do not use new technologically automated tasks with capital. But in that range, you're of course never going to do technological automation, because you do technological automation, nobody uses it. So that's why this curve here starts here at 0 and it's upward sloping. And this is the curve for the value or normalized value of doing new labor intensive tasks. And you can show that this is always steeper than this, and this one starts below. So they should intersect once and uniquely. And it should have exactly the right properties in terms of stability, except that this doesn't guarantee that this one is above this one when we come to N1. So we can have that this guy here can start very high everywhere above it. What happens in that case? We go to we go to an economy in which all tasks are produced by labor, just like the standard endogenous technological change model, and you keep on doing innovations just like in the quality ladder model. You just ignore capital. That's not the interesting case. That's not the empirically relevant case. So the empirically relevant case is that these two guys intersect. Well, if this guy is steep enough, they do intersect. So that was the condition here, that ki over kn is greater than k bar. So now you see the sort of the logic of the model and how it works and the self-correcting market forces. And if this model is correct, it says that if what we are doing is to hit the economy with new automation technologies, the market's going to self-correct. But it doesn't mean that necessarily the market's going to self-correct in response to everything. If there is a different type of technological change that actually changes ki over kn, then there will be no self-correction. So imagine that what we are experiencing is not a new wave of automation technologies, but a change in the nature of technological change, that moving onwards, from now on, it's much easier to do automation than creating new tasks. I don't know which one it is. The data doesn't speak loudly enough. But if that's the case, what's going to happen is that we go from here to here. So we're going to have a permanent decline in n. So this decline of labor relative to capital is going to go on for a while, but it's again going to stabilize. It cannot go on forever. It won't reverse itself. So self-correction now doesn't take the form of going back to where we were, but it will take the form of we get stabilized at some point, because labor cannot get too cheap. It just cannot be too cheap in equilibrium. All right, so I've been emphasizing self-correction forces, but does that imply that this equilibrium is optimal? So does the market do the right type of self-correction? Well, you won't be surprised that the answer is in general no, because this is an endogenous technological change model with monopolistic competition. There are markups and all of that thing. But those are, of course, not what we care about. We want to understand the new economic forces that come in this model. We characterize all of those in the paper, but here, let me take a special case where we just focus on the new mechanism. So again, let me take the same restrictions as in that proposition that I gave you, and also let me either suppose the case in which monopoly markups go to 0, or we have already subsidized the monopoly markups, so the monopoly distortions are not there. And then this proposition says is that take any equilibrium that we have in this economy. We can always improve on it by having a higher labor-intensive task economy. So in other words, we can always improve on it by having more labor favoring technologies and less automation. Why is that? For a very first order effect, we think, which is that when firms do their automation technology, what do they look at? The wage. But in many of these models, the wage is above the opportunity cost of labor. So if the wage is above the opportunity cost of labor, you have usual distortions, in efficiency wage models and search models. They may or may not be second best efficient. In many of these, they are second best efficient statically. For example, in the search models, if you have the Hossios condition, it is second best efficient. But it doesn't matter whether it's second best efficient or not. There is that wedge between the wage and the opportunity cost of labor, and that wedge is always going to affect firms' decisions to automate. They're going to automate too much because they don't want to pay that quasi-rent, but the social planner couldn't care less about that. All right, so I think I am going down to 0. The one other 30 seconds, if there are questions, I'll answer it. One thing that you might worry about here is that if you have skilled labor as well as unskilled labor, this model might have implications for inequality that are interesting, counterfactual, correct, not correct. Well, you can actually embed skilled and unskilled labor, and under the right assumptions, there will be dynamics in that as a function of automation, but still could be consistent with the long-run trends. I'll just stop there.